My name is Ihor Havryshchak, and today is Thursday, May 29th. Let's review the most important news from this crazy world. Please subscribe to YouTube 24 and my personal channel, links in the description. Don't forget to like, comment and share where you're watching from. Your feedback drives us. Share this video to help promote Ukrainian language content and support our pro-Ukrainian stance.
Таким чином ми просуваємо україномовний контент і, звичайно ж, відстоюємо і просуваємо нашу проукраїнську позицію.
Zelensky is open to meeting with Putin, but the Kremlin dictator is reluctant. Donald Trump, the 47th US president, faces serious trouble with block decrees and a crumbling team. Meanwhile, Russia is delaying the memorandum transfer and is in a tough spot as Ukraine's military could soon acquire advanced missiles.
Усіма можливими способами затягує передачу так званого меморандуму, і на болотах дуже в них палає через те, що Збройні сили України можуть отримати дуже хороші ракети.
To begin with, the Ukrainian side is ready to meet with its Russian counterparts in any format, including talks at the level of leaders in the format of a trilateral meeting, President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelenskyy, dictator Putin, and the President of the United States. Zelensky said this during a conversation with journalists. To quote, "I think that one meeting will definitely be technical. We are ready to meet at the level of leaders. The American side knows this, and the Russian side knows this. We're ready for the Trump-Putin-I format, or Trump-Putin-Trump-Zelensky, and even a meeting with all three," the president said. He mentioned that in Saudi Arabia, the US met separately with Ukrainians and Russians, and a separate meeting took place in Istanbul. Ukraine is open to any format or location, including the Vatican, Switzerland, or wherever proposed.
Цитуємо далі президента. Ми готові до технічної зустрічі у Ватикані, Швейцарії або де скажуть, де запропонують.
We are also ready for a meeting at the level of leaders. If our decision can be discussed immediately, without technical meetings, we are ready to meet directly at the level of heads of state. If Putin is uncomfortable with a bilateral meeting, or if everyone wants it to be a trilateral meeting, I don't care, Zelensky says. I am ready for any format. The following is worth noting here. Putin will definitely not agree to a meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. First, it is not for nothing that his entire retinue from Lavrov to other minions has repeatedly stated that the Ukrainian government is allegedly not legitimate, that they have questions about who will sign the documents, and that some kind of coup has allegedly taken place in Ukraine. They are constantly emphasizing this, and Putin will not meet with Zelensky one-on-one, because in this way, he will legitimize the Ukrainian leader for Russia, and he will not agree to this. Also remember the entire history of the dictator. He never meets one-on-one with his enemies. Yes, it can be a bilateral, trilateral, or multilateral meeting. Remember the Normandy format, when in 2019 Zelensky met with Putin in the presence of Merkel and the French president, but definitely not in a bilateral conversation, because Putin is afraid, because Putin will not agree. And in general, you know very well that Russia sabotages any proposals for venues. They didn't like the Vatican, and now they are talking about Istanbul, so perhaps the meeting will take place there. They are also considering a summit meeting in Geneva, Switzerland, as Keith Kellogg, Trump's special representative for Ukraine, said at the White House. But Russia continues to thumb its nose and delay the process as much as it can. As for Donald Trump, he again mentioned strikes on Ukraine, again mentioned sanctions, but these statements from the head of the White House, the one who, unfortunately, was elected by the Americans, are no different from the previous ones. But let me quote them anyway, and we will analyze them a little bit. United States President Donald Trump said that he does not like what is happening in Ukraine, referring to the latest massive attacks by Russia. To quote, "I don't like what's going on. I can say that unequivocally. I don't like it when I see missiles flying at Ukrainian cities. It's not good. We will not allow it," he emphasized while speaking to journalists at the White House. In addition, the 47th president emphasized that he was ready for a trilateral meeting with the president of Ukraine and Putin anywhere if necessary. What did he say? I wish it had happened months ago, but we're working with Putin now and we'll see where it goes. Donald Trump was also asked about the possible imposition of sanctions, again because Putin does not want to make any contacts.
Також Дональда Трампа запитали про можливе введення санкцій, знову ж таки, в силу того, що Путін не хоче йти на будь-які контакти.
And do you know what Trump said? The same thing as before. He said that he would give a precise answer that Putin wants to compromise in 1 or 2 weeks. We have heard similar phrases from Trump many times before. He again mentioned that this war is not his, that it is Trump's war. Excuse me, Biden's, Zelensky's and Putin's, that 5,000 soldiers are dying every week. Everything is in a circle. There is nothing new, no concrete action on Trump's part. And in the United States itself, he is already being openly mocked, called a shorthand acronym that suggests that he always fights back, and that he is very angry about it. But in fact he is, because his phrases are simply repeated. In fact, he is in huge trouble right now because his illogical, chaotic, completely undemocratic policy is bearing fruit. In quotation marks, of course. Because the Federal Court of International Trade of the United States of America has unanimously declared illegal the large-scale import tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump. This was reported by Politico. A 3-judge panel ruled that the president exceeded his authority by referring to the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which, according to the court, does not give the head of state the right to impose trade duties on his own. According to the Constitution of the United States of America, this right belongs exclusively to Congress. That is, Congress would have to vote in the upper and lower chambers on whether to impose certain duties. The decrees on universal and mirror tariffs exceed any powers granted to the president, the decision says. Therefore, the court blocked the introduction of the previously adopted duties, which are 25% on imports from Canada and Mexico, 20% tariffs on Chinese goods, and 10% duties on imports from all trading partners of the United States. Reciprocal tariffs ranging from 20 to 50% on products from 60 countries, which were to have come into effect on July 9th, were also declared illegal. Let me remind you that 50% of the duties were to be imposed on July 9th against the European Union, but we see that this has been cancelled in the United States. The lawsuit was filed by 12 attorneys general, led by Oregon Attorney General Dan Rayfield, who said, "The Constitution does not give any president unlimited power to undermine the economy." According to CNN, the White House's appeal left the situation uncertain for consumers and companies and potentially prolonged the fight over whether the tariffs remain in effect. Let me remind you that this is not the first time that Trump's absurd laws have been vetoed. Now we're talking about tariffs, and earlier we mentioned the blocking of the Voice of America and Radio Liberty, and there are a huge number of cases in the courts that Trump is likely to lose, appeal again, and the chaos will continue. In this way, Donald Trump is trying to destroy the deep state of the United States of America. We have talked about this many times, but we see that he is losing this fight, and people are leaving him. Let me remind you that Elon Musk is a billionaire who had a special position, was a special government official, and had a significant influence on Donald Trump, at least at the beginning of his term. Just remember Volodymyr Zelensky's conversation with Trump, the first phone call where Elon Musk was present. So, the billionaire and head of the US Government Performance and Results Administration, the Dodge structure that worried everyone, is leaving the Trump administration. He wrote about it on his X network. "My term as a special civil servant is coming to an end. I would like to thank President Donald Trump for giving me the opportunity to cut wasteful spending." Before that, Musk said he was disappointed with Trump's big and beautiful tax and budget law. In his opinion, this law undermines cost-cutting efforts and will lead to an increase in the budget deficit. This is true, as Trump's law unreasonably lowers taxes, which leads to huge budget expenditures and consequently a significant deficit. Moreover, Musk promised to save the US budget $1 trillion in 130 days, but it didn't work out. He failed and blamed the bureaucracy. So Trump's team is falling apart, having failed to accomplish anything that was predicted. Now Musk will return to his company Tesla, but he's also having problems there, because he's not very popular. Moreover, Tesla's sales in Germany fell by 70% after his policies, pressure on Germany, and interference in internal affairs. Just imagine.
Тепер він повернеться в свою Теслу, але в нього там теж проблеми, тому що не дуже його там вже й долюбляють. Більше того, продажі Тесла, наприклад, в Німеччині, після його політики, після тиску на Німеччину і втручання в внутрішні справи, впали на 70% продажі Тесла в Німеччині, уявіть собі.
And Reuters reports that Putin is ready to end the war in Ukraine, but sets a number of conditions. The agency cites 3 Russian officials with knowledge of the talks who spoke on condition of anonymity. According to one of the sources, Putin is ready for peace, but not at any price. 3 Russian sources said that the Kremlin leader wants a written commitment from the major Western powers not to expand NATO eastward, meaning that Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and other former Soviet republics are officially excluded from membership. Russia also demands that Ukraine remain neutral, that some Western sanctions be lifted, that the issue of frozen Russian sovereign assets in the West be resolved, and that the rights of Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine be protected. According to one Reuters source, if Putin realizes that he cannot reach a peace deal on his own terms, he will try to show Ukrainians and Europeans, using military victories, that peace in the future will be even more painful. The Kremlin did not respond to the agency's request for comment on the reports. Putin and Russian officials have repeatedly stated that any peace agreement should address the root causes of the conflict, meaning NATO expansion and Western support for Ukraine. Official Kyiv has repeatedly emphasized that Russia has no veto over Ukraine's aspirations to join the alliance. Ukraine also emphasizes the need for strong security guarantees from the West to deter any future Russian aggression. NATO has stated in the past that it will not change its open-door policy just because Moscow wants it to. When commenting on Putin's demands, we understand that these are red lines for Ukraine that will never be met, and Ukraine will never make such concessions to terrorists from the Russian Federation, because its membership in NATO and the EU is enshrined at the highest level.
Виконані ніколи на ці поступки Україна не піде терористам з Російської Федерації, тому що НАТО і входження в НАТО і в ЄС нас прописані на найвищому рівні.
We mentioned yesterday that more than 80% of Ukrainians who speak Russian hate Putin, do not support Russia, and do not need Russia's protection. The West and the European Union have clearly stated that sanctions against Russia will be lifted only when the last occupier leaves Ukrainian territory within the 1991 borders. At the beginning of the contacts, the United States tried to pressure the EU to lift sanctions if Russia ceased fire in the Black Sea, saying that if it lifted sanctions on agricultural enterprises, the attacks from the sea would stop. But the answer was categorical: we will not lift sanctions. As for the frozen assets, most of them, out of more than 300 billion, are in Europe, especially in Belgium, and no one is going to return this money, and the earnings from these assets are actively sold to Ukraine.
Вони знаходяться в Європі, а особливо найбільше їх знаходиться в різному виді в Бельгії. І ніхто ці гроші віддавати не буде. Заробітки з цих заморожених активів, ми знаємо, активно передають Україні.
The UK will hand over 3 billion. Other countries are also handing over, and it's not about unfreezing assets at all. On the contrary, as German Chancellor Friedrich Merkel has said, they are even looking for legal grounds not just to use the profits from these funds, but to try to confiscate them, so the Kremlin should forget about this money. All this rhetoric and tambourine dancing around the memorandum that the Russians are supposed to hand over is no longer relevant. Ukraine has already handed it over, and we will talk about it later. Russia claims that it may contain a potential ceasefire, but we know very well that the proposal for an unconditional cessation of active hostilities has been rejected by Russia and Putin on numerous occasions, although this proposal has come from Ukraine, the United States, and the entire sane world, including Europe. Well, let's not dwell on this, we have already talked about this a lot. Lavrov came out and said that Russia had finally drafted its memorandum on ending the war against Ukraine, but would only show it at the talks in Istanbul. This raises a question, because it was agreed that after the 1,000 for 1,000 exchange agreed upon in Istanbul on May 15 to 16, Russia would immediately hand over its memorandum, and now they say that this will happen after the talks in Istanbul. According to Lavrov, Russia proposes to hold such talks on June 2nd. Let me remind you that the day before, Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan was in Moscow, met with Putin and Lavrov, and proposed a platform in Istanbul, which Lavrov confirmed as acceptable. Now Fidan will be in Ukraine today or tomorrow, and obviously on June 2nd there will be a meeting at the technical level. I will comment further on Lavrov's words. The Russian side, as agreed, promptly drafted a memorandum that sets out their position on all aspects of reliably addressing the root causes of the crisis. There will be no cessation of hostilities because the root cause, again, is NATO, the Russian language, and obviously the Orthodox Russian Moscow Church, which is allegedly being infringed upon in Ukraine. But in fact, they are agents we know very well, KGBists. Our delegation, headed by Vladimir Medinsky, is ready to present this memorandum to the Ukrainian delegation and give the necessary explanations during the second round of talks on Monday, June 6th, Lavrov said. He referred to the root causes of the crisis that we have just discussed, and it is already possible to predict and actually state that it will not be possible to reach an agreement in Istanbul. That's why the Russians are delaying the memorandum and coming up with different reasons. As for Istanbul on June 2nd, let me remind you that 99% of the population is Muslim. The Russians claim the Vatican is unsuitable for talks, citing Orthodox Catholic differences, an argument widely seen as a poor excuse. Ukrainian Defense Minister Rustam Umerov, who led the talks in Istanbul, said he handed over Ukraine's position to Russia and was waiting for a response. Despite Russia's delay in providing their ceasefire proposal, pressure from President Trump, European leaders, and President Zelensky led to them announcing the memorandum. Umerov confirmed Ukraine's readiness for a full, unconditional ceasefire and continued diplomacy.
Я передав очільнику російської делегації наш документ, який відображає українську позицію. Вони отримали цей документ. Ми підтверджуємо готовність України до повного та безумовного припинення вогню та подальшої дипломатичної роботи.
ChatGPT said, "We are not against meeting with the Russians, and we are waiting for their memorandum, so that the meeting is not empty and can really bring the end of the war closer." Umerov also added that the Russian side has at least 4 more days before the flight to hand over their document to Ukraine for processing. Ukraine has always been and will always be as constructive as possible. A meeting between the parties should produce results. That is why every meeting must be properly prepared. The Russian side promised to hand over the memorandum immediately after the exchange. We urge the Russians to immediately fulfill this promise and stop trying to make the meeting destructive. This is what we see. Any meeting is planned, prepared, and all the relevant preparations are needed. Ukraine handed over a memorandum, and by the way, Umerov spoke with Medinsky on the phone to process it. But what does Lavrov say? We'll meet on the 2nd of the month, sit down at the table, and we'll hand you the memorandum. Although they had agreed to give the memorandum the day before, so that Ukraine could properly familiarize itself with what Russia was offering, and only then sit down and talk. How will it work here? Russia has become marginalized, had time to come up with something, sits down at the table and says, "Now you read," but you have literally no time. This is an absolutely savage policy and unacceptable to the terrorists, although expected. Moreover, the Russian Federation will not hand over a document with its vision of ending the war to the United States. This was stated by Maria Zakharova, a spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry. We don't know what the Ukrainian side handed over and when, Zakharova commented on the words of U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine Keith Kellogg, who said on Fox News that he had received a list of terms of a peace agreement from Kyiv and was now waiting for a similar document from Moscow. Zakharova claims Russia exchanges documents with Ukraine directly, but this is false. They're only willing to hand it over in Istanbul on the 2nd of the month. If Russia is truly committed to peace, why delay the memorandum? And it's very simple. They want to keep Trump as an intermediary, as someone who will come out every day and say, well, look, Russia is taking steps to the meeting, but they do not want to hand him documents because they do not want to directly involve him in the nuances of the negotiation process. They want to mirror the year 2022, when a delegation of Ukraine and Russia met in Istanbul with Turkish mediation, and again tell, as Medinsky said on May 15-16, that they want to fight and can fight forever, that Ukrainians are Russians just a little different, and all the other stuff they were carrying. Moreover, remember that after Putin and Trump spoke on the phone on May 19th, the 47th president said that he had suggested even to the Europeans that the war should be decided by Ukraine and Russia because they knew the nuances of this war best. In other words, Putin fed Trump some historical nonsense. And here Zakharova confirms that they want the United States to babble in the background, but not to participate in the process itself, because then the United States will be better able to understand and see what unacceptable conditions Russia is offering. I'll remind you that Keith Kellogg actually said the day before that Russia should hand over, and Zakharova should hand over. No, we are not going to hand over anything. No, we are not going to hand over anything. That's all you need to know about these negotiations. That's all you need to know about how Russia is trying to drag them out in order to continue its offensive actions and not fulfill any of its obligations. It again looks like this. Again, we are ready, but we are putting forward a huge number of unacceptable conditions, and the most important thing, and in fact yesterday, Volodymyr Zelensky paid an official visit to Berlin, where he met with the new German Chancellor, The meeting was held in a very good understanding atmosphere. It is really clear that there is a good relationship between Volodymyr Zelensky and Friedrich Merz. German Chancellor Merz said that Germany would finance the production of Ukrainian long-range weapon systems and would not impose any restrictions on the range of their use. He made the announcement at a joint press conference with Volodymyr Zelensky on 28th of March. The program of the Ukrainian leader's visit to Germany also included a meeting with Federal President Steinmeier, which Volodymyr Zelensky did hold. What are you interested in? It is important to note that the Spiegel newspaper wrote that Volodymyr Zelensky had urgently interrupted his trip and returned to Ukraine earlier than planned due to Russian offensives in the north of our country. But this information was denied. It is fake. Volodymyr Zelensky left Germany as scheduled. What did they agree on in Germany? First, this is very important. We did not just want Germany to give us missiles, but this is not a transfer of missiles, because this is a limited resource. There are warehouses. There is a critical reserve that the partner, in this case Germany, cannot transfer. But we agreed on joint production, which means that firstly, our military-industrial complex is constantly being strengthened. Secondly, these will actually be our domestic missiles. No one will tell us where, how and when to hit them, as Friedrich Merz also says. And thirdly, it will be an endless process. It's always production, production, production. Moreover, at the level of defense ministers, Boris Pistorius and Rustam Umerov signed an agreement worth 2.2 billion euros to produce Iris-T air defense systems and missiles for Ukraine. This is very, very good news and will really strengthen Ukraine's defense of the sky. No one is saying anything about the timing. But Germany has already warned that it will not go into details, constantly telling what is being transferred to Ukraine and how it is being agreed upon. Friedrich Merz also avoided the question about the Taurus he promised to give us, these cruise missiles, but later Volodymyr Zelensky said that he and Merz were talking about the Taurus transfer one-on-one and would not announce anything at the request of Friedrich Merz. And just so you understand, Germany said that it is allocating 5 billion euros in aid to Ukraine. This is unprecedented, and obviously Germany is becoming our main partner.
Ну і аби ви зрозуміли. І, до речі, Німеччина сказала, що вона виділяє допомогу Україні на 5 мільярдів євро. Це безпрецедентно, і це, очевидно, Німеччина стає таким головним нашим партнером.
Previously, it was the United States. Germany was in second place, and now it is official Berlin. And you should know how hot the swamps were because of the possible transfer of Taurus missiles to Ukraine, which our representatives and German representatives simply won't talk about. Simonian wrote about it, and official propaganda sources of the Russian Federation wrote about it. And Dmitry Medvedev was the one who got the most fired up in the swamps. A RIA Novosti propagandist asked him whether strikes with long-range missiles on Russian territory would mean Germany's direct involvement in the war, and whether Russia would have the right to strike German territory. What did Medvedev say? Thus, Germany is once again Russia's enemy, once again participating in the war, guided by the Nazi ideology they created. And Merz, a loyal follower of his relatives who fought in the Wehrmacht, in the presence of evidence that German military specialists are involved in launching long-range missiles into Russia, continued his delusion. So now that's it. Germany is Russia's enemy, and we will hit them, Germany, with our weapons. In fact, I am convinced that these intimidations have absolutely no effect on Friedrich Merz. But I tell you, they have been very, very hot in the swamps. By the way, at the same time, the new head of the German Foreign Ministry, his name is Wadeful, is visiting the United States of America. After a meeting with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Johannes Wadeful said he was optimistic that the United States would impose sanctions on Russia if dictator Putin continues to evade a peace agreement with Ukraine. This was reported by Bloomberg. We quote, "We have a common position on Ukraine. Here in the United States, more than 80 senators are ready to consider and pass a bill on sanctions in Congress. This is not in the hands of my interlocutor today. The interlocutor is a voter, but in the hands of the Senate. But he, like me, assumes that if Putin continues his policy, measures will be taken." According to Bloomberg, President Trump has made it clear to Ukraine and its allies in Europe that his administration is ready to impose sanctions. And just so you understand, he talks a lot about these sanctions. We mentioned Trump today, but Marco Rubio is also, as the Wall Street Journal reported, putting pressure on Trump to impose sanctions. The Congress is pressuring Trump to resort to sanctions. The whole world is pressuring Trump to limit Russia. And obviously the decision on Trump's part will not be what he would like, but this pressure from the whole world will force him to take these unacceptable and unpleasant steps.
Тиск з боку всього світу змусить його піти на ці такі неприйнятні для нього, неприємні для нього кроки.
On a more important note, and this is very important news, Belgium, and especially Turkey, has expressed its intention to join the international coalition of drones for Ukraine, which is led by Latvia and the United Kingdom. This brings the total number of members of this coalition to 20 states in Vienna. This was reported by the press service of the Latvian Ministry of Defense following the summit on drones held yesterday, May 28. It is noted that the member states of the coalition have pledged to allocate at least 2.75 billion euros by the end of 2025 to purchase drones and support the armed forces of Ukraine. This is very important. Moreover, Turkey, which has relations with Russia, has agreed to provide Ukraine with drones to use them to hit Russians over the head. This is also an important step, an important coalition, and an important unification in this direction. And in conclusion, I would like to tell you that Russia is actually having very big problems with its budget, because oil prices have fallen, and the budget of the terrorist country is not receiving trillions of rubles. At the end of April, the volume of oil exports from Russia averaged 3.4 million barrels per day, which is only 10,000 barrels less than the previous month. But what is interesting is that the total value of these supplies was the lowest in more than 2 years at about $1.2 billion per week. That is, Russia sold a little less, but lost much more in monetary terms due to low prices. Now they are chaotic and really don't know where and how to get money, and they can't predict what the budget gap will be at the end of this year.